Hey everyone! ChatGPT Taylor aka Taylor here. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we will be continuing the What If series, where I go over some hypothetical scenarios from Disventure camp that could have taken place if one critical event was changed. This video is a part 2 to the video from 2 weeks ago, where I talked about what would have happened if Riya didn't find the team swapper in episode 4 of season 2. If you haven't watched that video, I encourage you to give that video a watch first so you understand the exact scenario that we covered. But if you have watched that video, then get comfortable, because we're about to go through an adjacent scenario for this topic. If there are any specific what-if scenarios that you would like to see me play out in the future, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. And with that, let's get started. Before I begin, make sure to like and subscribe if this video is to your liking, and make sure to comment down below if there's anything that you would like to see going forward. Like last time, this week's topic was suggested by Subhashna Manikam, which is, what if Riya doesn't find the team swapper in episode 4 of season 2? In this episode, Riya used the advantage to send Yul, her biggest enemy in the game, to the orange team in exchange for Rosa Maria, who ended up becoming her strongest ally. We all know what happened next. James used Yul as a shield before poisoning him in the pre-merge. Riya and Rosa formed a strong bond before Riya betrayed their mutual ally. Riya heeded Carol's advice and played dirty by blindsiding Rosa, and James recovered from a nearly fatal blunder in the pre-merge to go on and win the season. We know one ending that we could have gotten if Riya didn't find the team swapper. But what other scenario is possible? Let's find out. Now, since this is part 2 of this topic, there has to be a difference between this timeline and the timeline in part 1 of this video. And I'll explain the difference. The difference is in who finds the immunity totem. In part 1, I stated that Rosa Maria would find the totem since she found the totem in canon. However, because Rosa Maria isn't swapped to the green team's camp in this timeline, it's possible that Rosa doesn't end up searching in the area where the totem is hidden, and that the totem could end up getting found by someone else. Therefore, this video will focus on what would happen if someone else finds the totem. And with that out of the way, let's finally begin. Again, we're going to assume that the team swapper advantage is never found, because otherwise we have to decide who else is most likely to find the advantage, and that's a toss-up in itself. So, it's just easier to move forward without the advantage. Without the advantage in play, Yul and Rosa stay on their respective teams. This shouldn't change the outcome of the challenge, since Crystal's final statement was about Aiden, not Yul. So, the orange team should still lose the challenge, and even if James tries to target Maggie for being too timid, James is probably targeted by the friendship alliance of Rosa Maria, Maggie, and Lake, since they considered eliminating him back in episode 2. And I think Aiden probably joins them, since he knows that there's no chance of saving James, not to mention that he probably still hates James for lying about him to Carol back in episode 2. So, James is voted out by a vote of 4-1. And already we have a major change with the eventual winner being taken out in the pre-merge. For episode 5, some things don't change. Lake and Aiden probably still have their early morning conversation where Aiden tells Lake that she needs to talk to Rosa again, and Hunter still runs away from Ali and Tess when they try to talk to him. But one thing that does change is that someone else finds the immunity totem. And for this video, I'm going to say that it's Yul. Since Rosa and Yul don't swap teams in this timeline, and because Rosa found the totem in canon, it's reasonable to assume that Yul could end up finding the totem since he's the one in Rosa's place on the green team in this timeline. And it's easily explainable. While Hunter is busy running away from Tess and Ali, Yul could just go to Riya and taunt her over having no friends or allies. If he does taunt Riya, then he'll end up in a similar location to where Rosa was when she was searching for the totem. Therefore, it's very possible that Yul could end up looking in the same spots near Riya that Rosa looked in, allowing Yul to find the totem. And that outcome is what we'll run with for this video. Now for the challenge. Again, since the only real difference is that Rosa and Yul are on their original teams and Maggie is here instead of James, and since none of them really had an impact on winning or losing the challenge for their team, I'm going to assume that the challenge ends the same way. Lake still refuses to remove her wig, and her team loses as a result. And for the vote, I think Maggie and Rosa easily vote for Aiden since he's the only one on their team who's not in their alliance. Aiden probably votes for Maggie, hoping that Lake would side with him. But since Lake and Rosa probably still make up in this episode, I have a hard time believing that Lake would want to turn against her alliance. So even though Lake probably still wants Aiden as a friend, there's nothing she can do to save him without jeopardizing her game, so she cast the third vote against Aiden, sending him out by a vote of 3-1. Aiden's out, and Lake probably apologizes for doing it, saying that she had to stay loyal to her alliance. I don't think Aiden would blame her for it, knowing that Aiden was more or less screwed due to James's misplay in episode 2. For episode 6, I'm going to start by changing the duos for the challenges slightly. Tess and Ali still stick together, and all their canon interactions in this episode stay the same. However, I'm going to put Hunter and Yul together, and I'll assume that Yul gives Hunter some spiel about how Hunter has to control Tess and Ali. Maybe Yul even tells Hunter about his immunity totem in an attempt to brag. Meanwhile, Rosa and Riya get paired together like in canon, except since this is the first time that they're interacting. Riya spends this time telling Rosa about how she feels alone on her team, and Rosa offers Riya the chance to jump ship and join her alliance, which she accepts. This leaves Lake and Maggie as a duo. Lake still gets taken away by Crystal and her storyline for the episode stays the same, but Maggie ends up alone and ends up finding Kai in the forest, where he assures her that she's doing well and that she needs to be strong in order to win the game. Other than that, nothing else changes. Lake stays in the competition against her father's wishes, and no one is eliminated. This episode's immunity challenge changes with Maggie taking James's place in Team 1, while Yul takes Aiden's place in Team 2. And since Team 1 absolutely destroyed Team 2 in the dodgeball section in canon, I'm going to assume that Team 1 still wins part 1 of the challenge. In order for Team 2 to win, Yul would either have to eliminate every member of Team 1 himself, which isn't likely, or Maggie would have to jump and shake her team's platform, causing her teammates to fall, just like in episode 1 with the boat, but I don't think that's guaranteed. So, Team 1 still wins. In the second round, it's Lake and Hunter versus Maggie and Riya. I outlined this scenario in a previous video, so I'll summarize it here. Basically, Maggie definitely loses this round because her large frame and shaky pedestal would make it harder for her to balance, causing her to fall. However, the direction in which she falls ends up deciding who wins the challenge. If she falls forward into Riya, then Lake and Hunter compete in the final round, which Hunter wins, just like in canon. If Maggie falls backwards into Hunter, then Lake and Riya compete in the final round, and Lake probably wins since she was really close in canon. And if Maggie falls sideways, then Riya advances to the final round, and probably faces off against Lake since she seemed to have the upper hand against Hunter in their matchup, meaning that Lake still goes on to beat Riya in part 3. Therefore, since 2 of the 3 possible scenarios end with Lake winning immunity, I'm going to assume that Lake wins immunity here. Now for the vote. I assume that the Poly Trio and Yul stick together and vote for Maggie, seeing her as the next biggest threat in the opposing alliance. Meanwhile, the Friendship Alliance sticks together and votes for Yul, as he has attacked each of them in some way, shape, or form. This leaves Riya as the swing vote, and considering her outsider status on her team, combined with Rosa being kind to Riya in the previous episode, Riya makes the choice to flip on her alliance and vote for Yul, causing a 4-4 tie between Yul and Maggie. Since Yul has the totem, I considered whether or not Yul would play his totem for himself ahead of time. However, I'm going to decide against it, since Yul is generally an overconfident individual, so he might be so blinded by his perception of his game that he might not consider the possibility of Riya flipping on him, especially since Riya hasn't really spoken up against Yul in this timeline. So, the final vote is 4-4, requiring a tiebreaker. And since no tiebreaker has happened so far in this timeline, then that means that the rock-paper-scissors tiebreaker ends up being used. And even though James suggested the tiebreaker in canon and he's not here in this timeline, Crystal canonically had nothing prepared for a tie, and there's very little time to prepare a better challenge, so Crystal would likely want something quick and easy. And since rock paper scissors is a pretty common game, it's not impossible for someone else to suggest it as a tiebreaker challenge. So, I'm going to assume that rock paper scissors is still chosen as the tiebreaker challenge. And since Maggie lost to Yul in this exact tiebreaker in canon, I'll assume that Maggie still loses and is eliminated. Sorry Maggie, but maybe you can still punch Yul in the face one last time before you leave. Going into episode 8, the pre-challenge interactions are a bit different. Since Rosa doesn't have her totem in this timeline, all she can do is strategize with Lake and Riya and try to create a plan on how to get the numbers back on their side. And due to Riya starting out on the same team as Hunter, Ali, and Tess, their plan is for Riya to make amends with the Poly Trio in hopes of getting them to see how deplorable Yul is. Meanwhile, the Poly Trio and Yul still reaffirm that they need to stick together. Maybe Hunter takes a bit of Yul's advice and tries to take charge, which may or may not make Ali and Tess uncomfortable, but they still decide to stick with him. Now for the challenge. This doesn't change from part 1 of the video, so I'll just quickly go through it. Rosa, Lake, and Riya go to the docks like they did in canon, Ali goes to shower like she did in canon, while Yul, Hunter, and Tess hang out in the cabins. Since the cabins are attacked later in the episode, we need to have one of these trio being killed away from the cabins. Thus, let's say that Yul gets annoyed with hanging out with Tess and Hunter, and leaves to get something from the mess hall. This gives Carol a chance to kill him first, prompting Rosa, Lake, and Riya to go back to the cabins. While this happens, Carol goes to the showers and kills Ali, just like in canon. Everyone then shows up at the showers, like in canon, where they find Ali dead on the ground. This prompts Hunter and Tess to go to the production tent to confront Nina, while Rosa, Lake, and Riya go to the cabins to barricade themselves. Maybe they even check to see if James left his spare phone in his bed before leaving. It's a slim chance, but it's better than no chance. At the production tent, Nina still jabs Hunter in the neck like in canon, viewing him as the bigger threat to stopping her. This causes Tess to run away, and likely goes back to the cabin where Rosa, Lake, and Riya are. Tess makes it back in time, the girls let her into the room, Carol still chops the door down with her axe, and Riya gets killed after helping the other girls through the window of the cabin. Lake, Rosa, and Tess then run to the bus, just like in canon. I'm assuming that Lake and Rosa take the front seats like in canon, since they seem to be the more assertive of this group of three. And since the killer eventually ends up in the bus, and since Tess is the closest to the killer in this scenario due to Lake and Rosa being in the front seats, Tess probably gets killed in this exchange, causing Lake and Rosa to flee. The challenge then ends the same way as in canon, with Rosa dying after trying to confront the killer outside the bus, and Lake dying after being pulled off the boat by the killer. But of course, no one was actually dying, and Carol wins the challenge by taking out the remaining competitors. And with Nina's persuasion, she ends up giving Riya and Lake immunity. Nina would do this because she wants the most drama, and since Rosa is the one that's connecting Riya and Lake together in an alliance, if Rosa does get voted out, it could throw some dysfunction into their alliance, potentially leading to drama. So how does the vote play out? Well, the majority alliance of 4 has to vote for Rosa, since she's the only non-immune camper who isn't in their alliance. Meanwhile, the new friendship trio votes for Yul, due to their mutual hatred of him. Carol probably sides with the friendship trio, wanting to earn their trust for future episodes. This would normally result in a 4-4 tie. But since Yul has a totem, and since he knows from the previous episodes that he has at least 3 campers voting for him, he can rationalize that he could easily end up in another tiebreaker if Carol doesn't vote with him. So, Yul would feel compelled to play his immunity totem for himself. This cancels out the 4 votes against him, sending Rosa home with the other 4 votes cast against her. It's a sad result, and Yul probably gloats at his successful totem play. For episode 9, a few things emerge before the challenge. For one, now that Yul just narrowly escaped 2 consecutive elimination ceremonies and sent home 2 people he hated, I think Yul would feel on top of the world and start bragging about how good he is at the game. He would feel so invincible that he would feel like he could do anything without consequences, including flaunting his power in the game. This would start to annoy the poly trio, specifically Ali and Tess, who already found his behavior annoying in the past. Meanwhile, Carol would try to rally Riya and Lake as allies, telling them that James and Aiden spread false rumors about her. While Riya would be receptive to Carol's wishes, Lake would be a bit apprehensive, having seen Carol's aggression firsthand while on the orange team. Now for the challenge. This is interesting because out of all the times that I've covered this episode, this is the very first time that Rosa isn't here to win part 1 or 2 of the challenge. Therefore, we need to decide another winner. Now, we have Yul, Tess, and Lake in this episode instead of Rosa, Aiden, and James. Could any of these 3 win? Well, we know that Yul doesn't like doing manual labor, so I doubt he can make a good sled. As for Tess, since this challenge is also judged on personality, I'm not certain that Tess could make something that Oliver would like. And for Lake, while she could make a sled full of personality considering how she's finally allowed to show her true personality at camp, I also kind of wrote her off in previous episodes of this series, so for the sake of consistency, I'll say she doesn't win this one. This means that the 4 remaining campers who were in this episode in canon are our candidates to win part 1 of the challenge. We can cross out Ali right away, since Oliver noted that it was a snowboard and not a sled. We can also cross out Hunter, since Oliver commented that it lacked personality. This leaves Carol and Ria's sleds as our 2 options, and based on how they look, I think Carol's sled matches closer to her personality, considering that it's sharp and dangerous. So, I'll say that Carol wins part 1 of this challenge. Since Carol wins part 1 of this challenge, she gets to do part 2 of the challenge on her own. Since she's not carrying anyone and she eventually gets help from a wolf along the way, she should be able to scale the mountain first and win part 2 of this challenge as well. But before we move forward with that, I want to talk about some interactions between the campers during this part. With Carol on her own, I see Riya and Lake pairing up, and Lake takes the time to warn Riya about Carol's general behavior, leaving Riya conflicted on who she should trust more between Lake and Carol. Meanwhile, Yul and Hunter pair up, and Hunter tries telling Yul to calm down and gloat less, but Yul doesn't listen, continuing to believe that he's untouchable. And finally, Tess and Ali pair up, with the 2 of them talking about how annoyed they are by Yul's behavior, and they agree to talk to Hunter about potentially flipping on him. With that done, let's get to part 3 of the challenge. Since Carol won part 2, she gets to pick her partner for part 3, and she chooses Riya, seeing this as a good way to build trust with her. With this pairing, Riya is the one blindfolded while Carol drives the sled. This leaves Lake to pair up with Oliver being blindfolded. The other 2 duos remain the same, with Hunter being blindfolded due to Yul's desire to remain in control, and with Ali being blindfolded due to Tessa's nervousness in being blindfolded. So who ends up winning this challenge? Well, I don't think Tess and Ali win. As I've established in previous videos, Tess might not speak loud enough for Ali to hear all her instructions, which could lead to a crash. As for Lake and Oliver, I'm not sure if Lake would have the motivation to be as aggressive as a driver than Carol or Yule, so even if she and Oliver don't crash, they probably won't move as fast as Carol or Yule's sleds, taking them out of contention. This leaves Carol and Riya versus Yule and Hunter. And while I feel like both Carol and Yule are aggressive enough to travel faster and possibly even ram into the other team's sled, I feel like Yule is more likely to completely neglect the goal of the challenge in favor of trying to ram Carol's sled. And what I mean is that once Carol rams into his sled, Yule might fixate completely on trying to screw over Carol, rather than pay attention to the challenge. So, while Yule tries to ram Carol's sled, he might not pay as much attention to the obstacles in front of him, causing Yule and Hunter to crash, leaving Carol and Riya to cross the finish line and win immunity. And even if we set aside the ramming, Carol was ahead of Hunter for the majority of the challenge in canon, so it's not unreasonable to think that it would stay that way in this timeline. With Riya and Carol immune, who gets voted off? Well, I still think that Lake, Riya, and Carol vote for Yule, still seeing him as a nuisance. As for Yule and Hunter, I think they vote for Lake, since she's the only one not in their alliance that's eligible to be voted for. This leaves Tess and Ali as the swing votes. And although they're in an alliance with Yule, I could see them being so annoyed by Yule's behavior that they flip on him. Also, we can connect this to another canonical plotline by having Tess and Ali talk to Hunter about Yule's deplorable behavior. And since Hunter is more strategically minded, he would tell Tess and Ali that they need to keep Yule around for the numbers, and that they just have to deal with Yule's behavior. This would make Tess and Ali feel upset since it would seem like Hunter cares more about placating Yule than making them happy. And with the canon plotline of Ali feeling like Hunter is being too controlling, Ali could pitch to Tess that they need to take control of their own game by taking out Yule on their own terms. It may not be the best move from a game perspective, but Tess and Ali aren't necessarily the best game players in this universe, so it's not impossible. And due to this, I see Ali and Tess flipping on their alliance to take out Yule by a vote of 5-2. Yule ends up leaving camp in a fit of rage, with Hunter being extremely confused as to what happened. Now we're down to 6 campers. But before we head into episode 10, we need to reduce this group to 5. In canon, we didn't have to worry about it since Carol was medically evacuated. But because that doesn't happen in this timeline, we need to have another elimination ceremony to bring the season back into balance. Assuming that Carol and Riya get to keep their immunities, I assume that Hunter still votes for Lake, since she's his only non-ally that's not immune. Meanwhile, Lake, Carol, and Riya vote for Hunter, since they might assume that Tess and Ali joined them for the previous vote and thus wouldn't want to vote for them. This leaves Tess and Ali as the swing votes, and even if Tess and Ali aren't happy with Hunter taking control, I don't think it would be enough to want to vote Hunter out directly. So, I think they join Hunter in voting for Lake, causing a 3-3 tie between Lake and Hunter. This means that we need to go to a tiebreaker, and honestly, Lake and Hunter are more evenly matched than you might think. We all know that Hunter canonically won a lot of immunity challenges, although one was given to him by Carol, one was done despite breaking the rules, and one of them should have gone to Lake if it weren't for an errant golf ball. And when Lake and Hunter faced off against each other in Season 2, Lake definitely held her own. So I could see either Lake or Hunter coming out on top in a tiebreaker challenge. Because I feel like they're pretty even, I'm going to make the decision that I think is better for the story. And I feel like if I kept Hunter in the game, then he, Ali, and Tess would end up as the final 3, and that's not very exciting. So, I'm going to say that Lake wins instead, causing Hunter to get eliminated. He's probably extremely disappointed, wondering how he lost control of the game so quickly. To start, let's look at some pre-challenge interactions. I think Carol, Riya, and Lake would reaffirm their loyalty to each other and agree to go to the finale together. However, Carol would quietly have a talk with Riya about how they don't fit in with the others, and that they need to do whatever they can to make it to the end, even if it means being a bit villainous. This would further confuse Riya, wondering what exactly is best for her game. Meanwhile, Ali would probably be really upset that Hunter is gone, while Tess would try and console her. They would agree that they can't afford to sit back and wallow, and that they need to convince one of the other 3 to flip and join them. I think they would see Lake as the best candidate, since they could think that Carol and Riya are close with each other due to Carol picking Riya as her partner in the last challenge. Now we get to the challenge. I suspect that the duos of Carol and Riya and Tess and Ali will target each other. Meanwhile, I think Lake would try to stay neutral whenever possible, but she would probably lean towards targeting Tess and Ali due to her loyalty to Riya. Due to these dynamics, I think Tess and Ali are the first 2 campers to be eliminated from the challenge. However, I do think that because of the decent possibility of Ali having shooting experience from playing first-person shooter games, she would have decent accuracy. So by the time that she and Tess are eliminated, let's say that Carol and Riya each have 1 balloon left. And since Tess and Ali are now out, Carol sets her sights on Lake, since Carol trusts Riya more by this point. But because Carol has 2 less balloons than Lake by this point, I think Lake should be able to eliminate Carol without too much trouble, although Carol should be able to take out at least 1 balloon from Lake. This leaves Lake and Riya as the last 2 in the challenge. Now, Riya hasn't exactly proven herself to be a very accurate individual, since she canonically couldn't hit Nina with watermelons, and we don't know if any of her dots hit Hunter's balloons in canon. So because of this, I'm going to say that Lake manages to outshoot Riya, allowing Lake to win immunity. This brings us to the vote. I think Carol and Riya vote for Ali since they see her as being more vocal and active than Tess. Meanwhile, Tess and Ali vote for Carol since they see her as a bigger overall threat than Riya. This leaves Lake as the swing vote, with Tess and Ali pitching to Lake that Carol and Riya are getting really close. This isn't an easy decision for Lake, and it took a bit of thought. And this is what I ultimately concluded. If Lake were to vote for Carol, it would be because she's afraid that Riya would be more loyal to Carol than to her. However, based on what we've seen from Lake in canon, I can't say that Lake has ever been worried about people's loyalty to her. Therefore, I'm not fully convinced that Lake would actually be worried about Riya's loyalty to her, and thus, Lake wouldn't feel a dire need to take out Carol immediately, especially since Carol hasn't voted against Lake up to this point. So ultimately, I think Lake sticks with her alliance and votes for Ali, sending the gamer girl home by a vote of 3-2. Sorry Ali, but the game's the game. Once again, let's look at some pre-challenge interactions. For one, Carol, Riya, and Lake celebrate the previous ceremony and agree that they're so close to the finale. But once Lake leaves, Carol would tell Riya that they need to consider voting out Lake, due to her being a much bigger physical threat than Tess. Riya would visibly hesitate, wondering if she needs to betray Lake in order to win. Meanwhile, Lake would go to Tess and tell her that she's willing to work with her, and that even though her friends are gone, she can still make it to the end. Tess would be quite distraught over Hunter and Ali's eliminations, and a part of me wants to say that Tess would become a bit ambivalent over what happens next, considering that she's never had to play the game alone before. So, I think she would probably go with whatever she thinks will save her. Now for the challenge. The results of this challenge are determined by how fast the campers are and how willing they are to jump off cliffs. Since I don't think it's confirmed if any of these 4 campers have fears of heights, I think it's safe to assume that the order in which they arrive at the cliffs is the order in which they jump off. And since the order in which they arrive is dependent on their running speeds, whoever's the fastest should arrive first, and thus jump off first. And thanks to episode 1's run to the camp, we know their running speeds. In that episode, Lake arrived at camp first, followed by Tess, then by Riya, and with Carol at the back. So, I think it's reasonable to assume that Lake jumps off the top cliff, with Tess going off the second tallest cliff, Riya going off the third cliff, and Carol going off the lowest cliff. And based on these results, this means that for the second part of the challenge, Lake will be shooting watermelons, Tess will be shooting pineapples, Carol will be shooting lemons, and based on what I've said in previous videos in this series, Riya will be shooting grapefruits, since those are smaller than pineapples but larger than lemons. So who wins this part of the challenge? Well, I doubt that it's Riya, since she canonically couldn't win with watermelons as her ammo, so I doubt that she could win with smaller ammo. I also don't think that Tess could win, since there isn't really any evidence to suggest that Tess would be able to accurately shoot things. This leaves Lake and Carol as our candidates for immunity, which is funny, since the 2 of them were the ones responsible for shooting at the finalists in the canon finale. Now, Carol was technically more accurate in that episode since she actually managed to knock James off his bike, but Lake was still accurate enough to grace Riya with some of the golf balls. So since their accuracies are at least somewhat similar, I'm going to give the edge to Lake, since she has the bigger ammo, which should give her an advantage here. Thus, Lake wins immunity. But who gets voted out? Well, I think Carol easily votes for Tess, since there's no incentive for her to vote for Riya. I think Tess votes for Carol, since she knows her the least. As for Lake, I actually think she votes for Carol. Not only is Carol a bigger physical threat than Tess, but since Tess is generally less abrasive than Carol, I could see Lake believing that Tess is more deserving of being in the finale, especially if the 2 of them bond due to their adjacent interests. This leaves Riya as the swing vote. I think Lake would campaign heavily to Riya to try and get her to flip on Carol, citing her abrasive behavior and status as a threat. However, because of Riya's ongoing loyalty to Carol, I don't see her flipping on her, resulting in a 2-2 tie between Carol and Tess. This forces Carol and Tess into a tiebreaker, which Tess likely loses, considering that Carol has shown more signs of being a dominant physical competitor, and at least a more active competitor in general. Sorry Tess, but once again, you've missed out on the finale. Now we're at the finale, with Carol, Riya, and Lake as our finalists. First, we must figure out who each camper supports. I think Riya only gets one supporter, and that's Connor. And this is due to their deep connection early on in the season. As for Carol, I think she only gets Yul and James's support. Yul probably doesn't have the highest opinion of Carol, but considering that in this timeline, Yul failed in his attempt to take out Lake, and Riya tried to flip and get Yul out, I doubt he has a high opinion of Lake or Riya either. Additionally, Carol has more or less been in control of the game since the final 7, and for a villain like Yul, he might appreciate that aspect of Carol. As for James, he's generally shown himself to be someone who likes when people play a good game, even though he's far from a good game player himself. And considering that Carol was pretty much in control of the game since the final 7, that might be enough to earn James's support. This means that Lake gets the remaining 7 campers as supporters. Maggie and Rosa were easy since they were in an alliance together, and Kai would tag along due to his closeness to Maggie. As for Aiden, even though Lake voted him out, they still had pretty pleasant interactions before then, so I don't think it's a stretch for him to support Lake. For Tess, since Lake at least tried to help save Tess at the final 4, I think that would be enough to get Tess's support, since she wasn't really close to Carol or Riya. And because Lake tried to help Tess, I think that would also prompt Ali and Hunter to support Lake, since neither Ali nor Hunter were too close with Riya or Carol in this timeline. With these divisions, each finalist has to pick a helper. Riya definitely picks Connor since he's her only supporter. As for Lake, I think she picks Rosa since the two of them were really close while on the show, even though Lake probably has some stronger options in her support group. As for Carol, I'm going to say that she picks James, although I doubt that she's enthusiastic about it. I just don't think that Carol would think that Yul would care enough to try and help her. With that, let's get to the challenge. Part 1 is an uphill skiing and snowmobile race. For Riya and Connor, I actually think they end this section in first place, since they didn't really run into any hiccups in canon, and they only finished in second because Lake drove Aiden up the mountain faster than Connor drove Riya. And since Lake isn't driving, there's no one to beat Riya for first place in this section. Speaking of Lake, I actually think her and Rosa finished this section in third place. Canonically, Rosa struggled to drive the snowmobile. And since the helpers have to drive the snowmobile, if Rosa continues to struggle like she did in canon, then Lake's performance will suffer as a result, likely falling behind into third, just like James did in canon. And for Carol, while there's no evidence of Carol being good with skis, she at least has solid balancing skills, considering she was able to stay upright while sledding downhill. And since James is driving, and James is known for driving pretty fast, Carol should be able to keep a very steady pace, allowing her to remain close to Riya. So, this section ends with Riya in first, Carol in second, and Lake in third. Now we have the driving section of the challenge. I'm going to assume that Riya and Lake drive, just like they did in canon, and that Carol drives, since she's assertive and would probably demand to take her spot in the driver's seat. With this setup, I think Carol actually manages to pull ahead of Riya. Considering how aggressive Carol was in the canon sledding challenge, she might not be opposed to speeding up and ramming Riya's car, just like Riya did to Lake in canon. Sure, Riya and Carol are allies, but now that they're at the finale, it's essentially everyone for themselves. So I don't think Carol would be against ramming Riya and pulling ahead. And since Riya isn't entirely evil in this timeline compared to the canon scenario, I feel like Riya would speed up to try and retaliate, but she wouldn't be as forceful about it due to her diminished evilness. So, I think Carol would be able to pull ahead after ramming her. As a result, since Riya and Carol are both speeding up, I don't think Lake will be able to pull ahead, even if she also speeds up. So, I think this section ends with Carol in the lead, followed by Riya, with Lake at the back. Now we have the climbing section. For Riya and Connor, they were able to maintain their position in canon, so they shouldn't struggle too much here. In fact, since Riya isn't super evil in this timeline, she doesn't stop to throw a rock at someone ahead of her, meaning that Connor won't stop to scold Riya for her villainy. This means that Riya should be able to move faster than she did in canon. As for Carol, since there's no evidence to suggest that Carol is good or bad at climbing, we'll assume that she's average. And considering that Connor struggled to pull Riya up the mountain, I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that James is at least as strong, if not stronger than Connor. And if this is the case, James should be able to at least help Carol maintain a similar pace to Riya as she climbs, allowing Carol to stay ahead of Riya. As for Lake, I don't think there's evidence to suggest that Lake is good or bad at climbing, so she's probably average. Her only saving grace is that Rosa seems to be strong in canon, so it's possible that she could pull Lake up the mountain pretty quickly, especially since Lake seems to be roughly the same size as Ali, who canonically doesn't weigh that much. So, let's say that Rosa's strength allows Lake to catch up to Riya, but they remain tied while Carol stays in first place. Now we're at the cliff portion, which comes down to who can get dressed in their wingsuit and glide down to the docks first. This is where I'm going to throw in a bit of a story for the sake of drama and keeping things interesting. Since Carol is in the lead, she reaches the top first and gets dressed in her wingsuit first. But before she jumps, stops to think. Carol knows that whoever gets to the dock last is eliminated. So in Carol's mind, if she can trip up one of her competitors right here, she can control who ends up in the final 2 with her. And considering that Lake won 3 individual challenges in this timeline and also tried to get Carol out at the last ceremony, I think Carol would want to take out Lake. So, once Lake and Riya get to the top, Carol steps up and shoves Lake, causing Lake to stumble and fall. Maybe she even falls far enough and ends up hanging off the cliffside, just like Aiden did in canon. Sure, this might seem a bit too far, but considering how Carol was not opposed to ramming James and Aiden while they were traveling downhill at a fast speed, shoving Lake doesn't seem too far-fetched. So while Lake is hanging off the cliffside, Carol jumps off and glides down to the docks, earning herself the first spot in the finale. This puts Riya in a tough position. Does she follow Carol's advice by abandoning Lake and playing for herself, or does she let her morals come into play and save Lake instead? I think for the sake of the story, Riya stops and saves Lake from falling off the cliff. Lake thanks Riya for saving her, which prompts Riya to apologize for not following Lake's decision to flip on Carol in the last episode. Having seen Carol's aggression and the lengths that she's willing to go to in order to win, Riya realizes that there are some lines that aren't worth crossing in order to be successful. And yes, I know that this is exactly the opposite of what happened to Riya in canon, but if you ask me, the event that really started Riya's heel turn was Aiden getting away with injuring Carol in episode 9. But since that doesn't happen in this timeline, I think Riya is still capable of coming back to the path of good morality. So with Lake and Riya back to being number 1 allies, they realize that only one of them can advance to the final 2. And for the sake of the story, I could see this playing out similarly to how James and Aiden resolved this in canon. Lake suggests jumping down together, but Riya acknowledges that Lake has a much stronger chance of beating Carol in the final challenge, and as such, lets Lake glide down to the docks alone, giving her the final spot in the final 2. This means that Riya gets eliminated in third, but hey, maybe her kind-hearted nature catches the eye of a Hollywood producer and they cast her as a nice girl character for one of their shows. That's the good ending for her. This leaves Carol and Lake as our final 2. But before we continue, we need to decide how far ahead Carol is ahead of Lake due to Lake nearly falling off the cliff. Well, since I compared Lake and Riya's conversation to James and Aiden's conversation, I'll assume that these conversations are of similar length. Therefore, Carol's lead should be similar to Riya's lead in canon. This means that by the time Carol reaches the floating platform, Lake should probably be just leaving the docks, which I think is reasonable. To kick off part 2 of the challenge, we have the boat driving section. We know from episode 1 that Lake can drive a boat pretty well, so that confidence should help her drive faster than average. However, considering Carol's aggression, she would probably drive faster than average. So, Carol should maintain her lead heading into the diving section. Now, we have no evidence that Carol is good or bad at scuba diving, so I think we have to assume that she's average. And for James, I don't think there's any clear evidence to suggest that James knows how to read a map well, so we probably have to assume he's average as well. So, I think it's reasonable to assume that by the time Carol is swimming through one of the tunnels leading to the large cavern, Lake has reached the floating platform. Now for Lake, we eventually saw her scuba diving in season 3, and she didn't seem to be scared at all. After all, once Lake heard Aiden screaming from a cave, Lake didn't hesitate to swim over to the cave, knowing that there could be a dangerous animal in there. And considering Lake's independent mindset in that season is probably similar to her mindset here, I don't think it's a stretch to think that Lake would feel confident enough to go full throttle in this section. And with Rosa canonically being able to help James and Riya out of the caves pretty quickly, this should help Lake make up some of the distance behind Carol. So for argument's sake, let's say that by the time Carol resurfaces and is about to leave on her boat, Lake has just exited the cave with her key, and I honestly think that's being conservative. Now we head into the final section, which is a motorcycle race while avoiding obstacles and golf balls being shot at them. Once again, we need to decide who steps up to shoot the golf balls for each camper. If we assume that Riya and Connor support Lake due to Lake being more of a heroic person, Lake has 9 people to choose from while Carol only has 2 options. However, since James is busy driving with Carol back to shore, this means that Yul is the only Carol supporter left, meaning that he has to step up and shoot for Carol. As for Lake supporters, let's use the process of elimination. Firstly, Rosa is busy driving with Lake, so she's out. Kai, Maggie, and Tess are quite passive, so they're out. And Connor doesn't have a strong connection with Lake, so he's out too. This leaves Aiden, Riya, Ali, and Hunter left, and I'm going to say that Riya steps up, since she would want to fully show Carol that she's no longer under her control and that she doesn't have to sacrifice her friendships for fame. With Yul and Riya as the ones shooting golf balls, are either of them able to hit their targets? Honestly, I'm not convinced that either of them will be very accurate. Yul hasn't really shown any signs of being overwhelmingly accurate, and Riya at best may have shot one balloon off of Hunter, but that's it. So I don't think either of them would be able to greatly affect Lake and Carol's chances of winning as is. And since both Carol and Lake are probably driving faster than average due to Carol's aggression and Lake's experience with motorcycles, they're probably driving at a similar pace, meaning that Carol should maintain her reasonable lead over Lake in this section. Therefore, the only chance of Lake being able to pass Carol is if Riya hits the Gatling gun like Lake did in canon, which would cause the gun to go haywire and fire a barrage of golf balls at Carol, which would make Carol fall and allow Lake to pass her. But does this happen? Since we know that the eliminated campers can watch prior episodes of the show, the eliminated campers should be aware of Crystal hitting the gun in episode 7, which caused it to go haywire. But the bigger question is, does anyone tell Riya to do this? Well, out of Lake's remaining supporters, the ones that I think would be vocal enough to potentially tell Riya to do it would be Aiden, Ali, and Hunter. And out of these 3, I actually feel confident saying that Aiden would tell Riya to hit the gun. And there are 3 reasons why I think this happens. Number 1, Aiden canonically did this for James in the season 2 finale, so it's definitely reasonable to imagine him doing this for someone he cares about. Number 2, Aiden and Carol didn't end on the best terms, so he might not want to see Carol win. And considering that James is also helping Carol in this timeline, and adding that James and Aiden didn't end on great terms in this timeline, Aiden might want to do whatever he can to stop James from feeling like a winner as well. But most importantly, Aiden and Lake still had a decent relationship in this timeline. Even though Lake ultimately voted Aiden out, I don't think Aiden would hold it against her, since he knew that there was a friendship alliance on his team, and he couldn't break them up due to James's idiotic decision to out Carol and Aiden's alliance in episode 2. And since Aiden and Lake did have a bit of a heart-to-heart conversation in episode 5, I think Aiden would feel enough of a connection with Lake to want to help her win. Thus, I think Aiden would tell Riya to hit the gun, causing the barrage of golf balls to go flying at Carol, knocking her off the bike very close to the finish line. And since Lake isn't too far behind Carol by this point, I think Lake is able to make up the extra distance and cross the finish line first, becoming the winner of season 2 of Disventure camp. So we have our answer: if Riya doesn't find the team swapper back in episode 4 of season 2 and Yul finds the immunity totem instead of Rosa, then James and Aiden are taken out in the pre-merge, Lake loses both Maggie and Rosa shortly after, then the majority alliance on the green team gets eliminated one after another, and Lake goes on to win the season. I can't figure out if I like this timeline more than what we actually got, but I definitely like it more than the timeline in part 1 of this video. After all, James pays for his critical pre-merge mistake, Carol isn't forced out of the game due to injury, Riya chooses the side of good rather than evil, and Lake, who some consider to be the best written character from this season, earns the pleasure of winning the season. And if we want, we could still have Hunter, Ali, and Tess resolve their issues in the finale, just like in canon. The only downside is that Carol sort of has to play the role of the villain for the last 4 episodes, and I don't know if the way I've written her in this timeline allows her to do that. But above all, I'm glad that there's at least one scenario that allows Lake to win and claim the prize money for herself. That would definitely help her start her new life away from her parents. And maybe she might give some to Rosa for her and her daughter. That would be a very happy ending. And that about does it for this video. What do you think of my theory? Do you agree with my thought process? Do you disagree? Did I miss something big that would impact the entire video? Either way, please let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Thank you very much for watching. Click like if you like the video, click subscribe if you really like the video, and for some ending words of wisdom. If you are going to ride a motorcycle, make sure that you are careful and stay attentive, otherwise you could end up crashing into a giant upright log in the middle of the road. Thank you, and farewell.